Thank you very much, Ben. It is such a privilege to be up here. As Ben said, I've not been up here for quite a while. So if you don't know me, my name is Mim. You might usually see me at the back. I've got 2 little ones. And usually I don't really get to be in this part of the service. I'm in the kids' room. And God still speaks through the kind of Bibles that we read in there. But it is a privilege to be here today with adults and learning scripture together. I am going to start today by telling you a story from my own wedding. I want to tell you about my wedding cake. Now, I married Will, who is the worship pastor here, back in 2013. And his wonderful Nanny June, she bought us our wedding cake. It was made by a professional, and she bought it for us as a wedding gift. And it was an incredible cake. We decided we wanted to go simple. So it was a Victoria sponge with raspberry jam and some whipped buttercream. But we had quite a lot of people at our wedding. So this cake was 5 tiers tall. It was really quite big. And I don't know if you guys remember the summer of 2013. I do, because it was a significant summer. It was the summer I got married. But in July 2013, there was a heat wave, and it was really quite hot. And on our wedding day, we had beautiful sunny weather. We'd had a wonderful ceremony at our local parish church, and we went to our reception venue, which was a marquee in the grounds of this Victorian house. And we were planning to have some PIMS, play some games. We had garden games and cricket and lots of wonderful things going on. And the staff who were working the wedding, they made a beeline straight for us as soon as we arrived. And they were like, "Mim, Will, welcome, have some PIMS. We need to cut the cake." And I was like, well, I think you'll find there's actually a plan for the day. And the cake isn't happening until much later on, right? We're going to play games. There's some canapes and things to eat. And we're just going to enjoy the sunshine. And we're not going to cut the cake until after we've eaten. And they looked at me and they were like, "No, Mim, we need to cut the cake." And I was like, "What are you talking about?" And they were like, "Can we just show you?" So Will and I went over to the marquee. And we walked in, and the cake, sure enough, it was like the Leaning Tower of Pisa. I mean, this thing, all of the buttercream was melting, dripping down the side, and the whole thing was just teetering on the edge. It was like it was about to fall on the floor and go splat. So sure enough, we changed our plan. We all kind of rushed into the marquee, cut the cake randomly, and then went back outside to enjoy the sunshine. And we had the cake later on in the day. That was my wedding almost disaster. And the story that we're looking at today is also at a wedding. It's 3 days into a wedding in a culture where a wedding would usually last about a week. And we are starting the story in the middle of a disaster. There are some differences, though. I think if our cake on our wedding day had gone splat onto the floor, it probably would have become a bit of a joke. I think some of my friends would have just eaten floor cake, and some people might have decided not to, but people would have laughed it off, and it would have become just this story that we would tell about our wedding day. However, we are in ancient Jewish culture when this story is taking place, and that is an honor-shame culture. And the bride and the groom are hosting all of their friends and their family. And hosting was really important. So if something went wrong with the way that you were hosting, it would be more than just embarrassment, but it would be humiliating for you and for your family. So here we are at this wonderful wedding. Everybody's celebrating, but we're in the middle of a disaster because the servants have discovered that we've run out of wine. And this is more than just a social faux pas. Running out of wine would bring humiliation and quite public shame upon this couple. So Mary, the mother of Jesus, she wants Jesus to rescue this couple from shame. So Jesus turns approximately 600 litres of water into wine. Yes, that is a lot of wine, but they're only halfway through this wedding, so there's a lot more celebrating to happen. The wine is provided, and Jesus has rescued the couple. And not only that, but we see in verses 9 and 10 that when the master of the banquet drinks this wine, he realizes that this wine is the best. So not only has Jesus rescued this couple from shame, but he has elevated the whole celebration for everyone there to new levels of joy. Now, we've heard from the end of the reading, and Ben pointed it out too, that this isn't just a miracle, it is a sign. Let's have a look at verse 11 again together. It says, "What Jesus did here in Cana of Galilee was the first of the signs through which he revealed his glory, and his disciples believed in him." So this story isn't just about a wedding. And it's not just about this cool display of power showing that Jesus can do amazing miracles, turning water into wine. We definitely couldn't do anything like that without the power of God. It is more than that. This is a sign of Jesus' glory, not just for the bridegroom, not just for the bride, not just for the guests of the wedding, but for us today too. It's a story that's full of symbolism, and it points to a deeper reality which is relevant for us. So there is one question that I want us to think about today as we explore this passage together. And that question is, what has Jesus come to do for us? And there are three focuses in the passage that we're going to look at to try and find the answer: the water, the wine, and the bridegroom. And we're going to start, you might be relieved to know, with the water and the wine together. So there's only 2 points to the sermon today, not 3. Water and the wine together. Let's have a look at those. So Jesus' choice of water is significant, and his choice of wine is significant in and of themselves. Water is used throughout the Bible as a symbol of purification. That means making yourself clean. Physically, we use water to make ourselves clean today. It's what we use to shower with, etc. But also, it is a symbol of something spiritual going on, a spiritual cleansing of our sin. And wine is often used throughout the Bible as a symbol of celebration and joy. We hear in Isaiah 25 a prophecy that points towards the banquet and the feast that we're going to partake in heaven with Jesus after the second coming. And it talks about this wine that is the choicest wine, the best wine, and lots of rich food that we'll get to partake in together. And what that's supposed to mean is celebration and joy, the joy that we're going to experience when there is no more pain, no more suffering. And there's something else that I want to pick out about the wine and the water that's significant, and that's that Jesus chooses ceremonial washing jars. Now, just picture the scene. They're 3 days into a wedding. There's lots of people there. Lots of wine will have already been drunk. And so behind the scenes, there's going to be absolutely loads of empty wine barrels. And Jesus could have used any of those to perform this miracle in. He could have chosen anything to hold the water that he's going to turn into wine. But actually, he chooses these washing jars that are used for religious ceremonies. The ceremonies that we're talking about are these repeated purifications or cleansings that Jewish people would do before they would then do a sacrifice, a blood sacrifice, usually of something like a lamb. And all of that was to make up for the fact that they were sinful. So they needed to cleanse themselves and atone for their sin and their brokenness so that they could connect with God. And so when Jesus chooses these ceremonial washing jars, what he's saying to his disciples and to his mother and to the servants around him is he's saying, I have come to fulfill those sacrificial laws in the Old Testament. I am fulfilling them. But what does that actually mean? Let's think about that in a little bit more detail. What has Jesus come to do for us? Let's look at verse 4. So Mary wants Jesus to rescue this couple from certain shame. And she says, well, Jesus, they've got no more wine. And Jesus says in verse 4, woman, why do you involve me? My hour has not yet come. And there's something that's slightly lost in translation here because it kind of sounds like Jesus is being rude. And he's not actually being rude to his mother, like, woman. That's not what he's doing. But he is actually using quite sharp and curt language here. He's saying, Mum, why do you involve me? My hour has not yet come. And Mary probably didn't know what Jesus meant by my hour has not yet come. But we've got the privilege of having the whole of the Gospel of John. Jesus uses this phrase several times throughout the Gospel. And every time he's referring to his death. So that means that in the middle of this celebration where there's so much joy and so much happiness, everyone's there with their loved ones and their best and nearest and dearest, Jesus, at the moment, he's not celebrating. He's thinking about death. He's thinking about the fact that he is going to have to die. This is a moment of vulnerability for Jesus because a few years after this miracle, he knows he is going to have to go to the cross. He is going to die in a way where he is broken and tortured and in so much physical pain. And in doing so, he will rescue the bridegroom, the bride, the celebrants at the wedding, and he will rescue us from our shame and our brokenness and our sin. Then he will rise again, and by defeating death, he will bring new levels of joy. Jesus knows that this is more than just one miracle, turning water into wine, but he knows that this is going to symbolize what he's doing on the cross, that he is going to have to die. And Dr. Edmund Clowney is talking about this moment where Jesus shows this vulnerability, and he describes it like this. Jesus sat amidst all the joy of the wedding feast, sipping the coming sorrow, so that today, you and I, who believe in him, can sit amidst all this world's sorrow, sipping the coming joy. So what Jesus provides for these wedding guests is this beautiful, luscious, delicious, choicest of wines. And the purpose is so that they can enjoy it. It's to bring joy. And what has Jesus come to do for us? Well, for us, this wine represents the blood of Jesus, shed for us on the cross. And by providing us with this blood, he removes our shame and he elevates us to new levels of joy. But in order to do this, Jesus has to sip his own cup. We get to sip this cup of perfection and joy. Jesus has to sip a different cup. In the Garden of Gethsemane, just before Jesus goes to the cross, when he's praying to the Father about what's about to happen, he says, God, let this cup pass from me. And then he says, do you know what? Father, your will be done, not mine. And he goes to the cross on our behalf. So what cup is he referring to there? Well, in Psalm 75, the psalmist in verse 8 describes a cup, and this is the cup that Jesus is metaphorically drinking from. It says this, in the hand of the Lord is a cup full of foaming wine mixed with spices. He pours it out, and all the wicked of the earth drink it down to its very dregs. This is a cup of sorrow. It is a cup filled with the wrath of God. It is a cup filled with the righteous and terrifying anger of God at sin in the world. It's the punishment for that sin that is held within this cup. What should be in Jesus' cup? Jesus should be dealt a cup that is full of perfection. He led a sinless life, a perfect life. So he should be able to drink that choicest wine, that wine that is delicious and full of joy and full of freedom. But he doesn't. He chooses to drink the cup that is for the wicked. He's sitting here at this wedding, having performed this miracle, and he's watching everyone else around him partaking in this beautiful wine. And he knows that he is going to have to drink this cup of wrath. And the reason that he does that is so that you and I will never have to experience the wrath of God as a result of sin. We will never have to experience that terror. We will never have to experience that pain and that punishment because Jesus took it for us. Now, we might still experience some of the consequences of sin. You know, we still know that there is pain in the world and there's sadness in the world and there's suffering in the world, but we will never have to experience that, the wrath of God, which is the worst possible thing that you could experience, being separated entirely from God the Father. Jesus does that for us. And instead, he passes us a cup of joy. So what does Jesus come to do for us? Well, the water and the wine are a sign which point to Jesus going to the cross, bearing the terrifying consequences for our sin, rescuing us from shame, and giving us new levels of joy. Now, there's one more part of the passage that I want to look at today, which is the bridegroom. And through the bridegroom, we're going to see that Jesus, firstly, does it for us. And secondly, that he then gives us the credit for what he's done. So let's jump back to the beginning of our story. We're at a big wedding celebration. There's been this public disaster. They've run out of wine, and it would lead to this public shaming of the couple. Now, what would I do in this situation? I would go into panic overdrive and I would be trying to fix it, right? I would want to somehow find something else for them to drink or something else to provide for them. I would desperately be trying to solve the situation because I wouldn't want people to think that I was bringing shame on my family. But there is nothing that the bridegroom can do. They don't have supermarkets. They don't have anywhere that they can go to find more wine. There is nothing that can be done. This shame that's going to be brought upon them feels completely unavoidable. Apart from Jesus. Jesus is the one who rescues them through this miracle. Now, how does this apply to us today? We are like the bridegroom. And actually, we are shameful. And I think sometimes we can think that to be ashamed, something specific and really bad has to have happened to you, or someone has to have spoken something over you which is going to make you feel shame about yourself. But actually, we all feel shame, and we just try to cover it up. So those of us, and this, please hear me when I say this applies to me too, there will be lots of us in the room who think, actually, I'm quite a confident person. I feel quite good about myself. I think I'm fine. But to you and to me, I would say, well, why do you work so hard all the time? And why do you desperately want to be right all the time? Why do you want things to be perfect all the time? Why do you care so much about how you look? All of those things are because we know inherently that there is something wrong with us. We know there's something wrong with us, and we are constantly trying to purify ourselves or prove ourselves, make ourselves feel like we are good enough. It's like the story of Adam and Eve right at the beginning of the Bible when they're naked in the garden and they know they've disobeyed God and they cover themselves with fig leaves to try and hide their nakedness and their shame. We are constantly covering ourselves with fig leaves through the successes in our lives. Being really good at our jobs, being a really great parent, being a really great friend. There are all these fig leaves that we're trying to cover ourselves with because inside we know that there is something wrong with us. So we all struggle with shame. And the thing is, we can't fix it ourselves. No matter how many self-help books you read, how many wonderful things people say to you about what a great person you are, no matter how many positive things you have stuck on your mirror to say how great you are and how beautiful you are, we cannot fix this brokenness ourselves. Only Jesus can do that for us. It is only Jesus who can take away our shame. And he does even more than that. He doesn't just take away the bridegroom's shame, and he doesn't just take away our shame, but he gives the bridegroom and he gives us the credit for it. Now, I don't know if you guys have ever had to give anyone else the credit for your work, but it's kind of hard. I'm going to tell you a story about a time when I was sort of forced into giving someone else the credit for my work. We're going to need to go back a few years to when I was doing my GCSEs. I was dating Will, my husband at the time, and we were revising for our English literature GCSE together in my parents' conservatory. And we were reading some of my essays. Now, English is my thing. I'm an English teacher. I did very well in my English exams, kind of all the way through school. And so I had some of these essays where I'd got 100%, right? We were looking particularly at our poetry essays. I don't know if anyone remembers their GCSE English, but you have to do this poetry anthology. There's 15 poems. You get given one poem in the exam, and then you've got to pick from your head one of the other poems to compare it to. And you're supposed to know all the quotations and all the ideas in your head. So we're looking through these essays, and there's one essay where I got 100%. And guys, it was a comparison of Lucozade and Yellow. I still remember it to this day. 2 poems in our anthology. And I was really proud of this, right? It was one of the best essays I'd written. I was really proud of it. Anyway, I shared it with Will. We revised. It was all fine. We turn up to the exam the next day. What was the given poem on my English literature exam? It was only Lucozade. And I sat there in the exam and I thought, I kind of took a glance at Will. We went to the same school, so he was just across the hall. And I was like, I know exactly what you're doing right now. You are writing a comparison of Lucozade and Yellow using all of my points from my 100% essay. I knew exactly what he was doing. And I, massive goody two-shoes, I'm like, well, I can't write those ideas down because they're going to find out that we've written the same response and we'll like fail our GCSE and we'll get, accused of copying one another in the exam. So I'm like, well, I'm going to have to compare it to an entirely different poem and do something totally new and from scratch in the exam because he is stealing my ideas. And sure enough, we came out of the exam and I was like, Will, what did you write about? And he was like, I wrote about yellow. And I was like, I knew it. I was like, did you use the points from my essay? He was like, yes, I did. So I was forced into giving Will the credit. He came out with an A. When GCSEs used to be marked in letters rather than numbers, he came out with an A in his English literature GCSE. But guys, don't worry. I came out with an A star, so it's fine. Turns out it's actually good to do something fresh rather than just copy your previous ideas. Anyway, if you can't tell, that was like 15 years ago now. So if you can't tell, I haven't got over it. It's really hard to give someone else the credit for something that you've done. But praise Jesus, he is way more gracious than me. So he performs this miracle, and we see in verse 9 that the master of the banquet doesn't know where this wine has come from. And Jesus and the disciples and Mary, they don't say anything. And so then the master of the banquet goes to the bridegroom and publicly in front of everyone, he says, verse 10, everyone brings out the choice wine first and then the cheaper wine after the guests have had too much to drink. But you have saved the best till now. What an amazing person you are. What an amazing host you are to save the best wine until now. How generous you are. Now, it wasn't actually anything to do with the bridegroom. He didn't do anything for himself. It was all Jesus. And Jesus gave him the credit for the work that he did. So, what has Jesus done for us today? He gives us the credit for the work that he did on the cross. When he drinks that terrifying cup, the punishment for all the sin, not just your sin and my sin, but the sin of everyone. He drinks that cup. And instead, that cup, which we deserve because we are broken and we get things wrong, that cup passes us by. And instead, we get to drink this cup of joy, this cup of peace, this cup of freedom. This is the generosity and the abundant grace of Jesus. It is nothing that we do. The bridegroom doesn't do anything in this story apart from be loved by Jesus. And we don't have to do anything apart from be loved by Jesus. And what we get as a result is we get to wear Jesus' righteousness. That perfect life that he led, we get the credit for it. And when we stand before God on Judgment Day, we are 100% clean, forgiven, and righteous. We get Jesus' credit. We are no longer in debt, but we are free. We are no longer in chains, but we are free. We are no longer guilty from what we've done, but we are free. We are no longer not good enough, we're free. We no longer have to care about the way that we look all the time. We are free. We no longer have to work really hard to prove ourselves. We are free. We are no longer ashamed, but we are free. Thank you, Jesus. So, we are almost at the end of my talk today, and we've still got a little bit of time, and I want to use that to respond to this message. In about 4 or 5 minutes' time, we're going to be doing communion together, which Ben is going to lead us through. What an amazing way to respond to this passage, because we get to come to the table and we drink the cup of joy, the cup of freedom. So I want you to be thinking as you come up for communion today, when you sip that wine, you are sipping freedom in Christ. When you sip that wine, you are elevated to new levels of joy. When you sip that wine, you know that one day you are going to be partaking in this incredible feast where there is no pain, no suffering, no shame. Before we get there, though, before we get to communion, there are a few things that I want us to be thinking about so that we can respond. And the way we're going to do this is I'm going to say those things now, and then we'll do communion, and then there will be prayer ministry going on at the side. And after you've taken communion, please go and get some prayer. And I can tell you now, I will 100% be there with you getting prayer, because this always happens to me when I prepare a sermon. But as you delve into the Bible, you just can't help but realize that you really need God. And I know that I really, really need God this morning. So the first thing that I want us to pray about later is if you're here and you've never heard this message before, you've never heard about what Jesus has done for us on the cross, but you want to get involved. You're like, well, actually, yeah, I do know that I'm broken and I want that wholeness. I do know that I'm living in this dark place and I want that joy. I do know that I feel ashamed and I want freedom from it. We would love to pray with you today to meet Jesus for the first time. So if that is you, please come forward and get prayer once you've been up for communion and a blessing. I also want you to come and get prayer if you know that you need freedom from shame. And that can be anything that has happened to you in your life that you know you're carrying the weight of shame for. But particularly this morning, God has been speaking to me for myself, let me remind you, for myself, but I think it's relevant for lots of people in the room too, about that shame that we do so well at covering up. When we are working really hard to prove ourselves, when we want everything to be perfect so that we kind of look good, when we care a lot about how we dress and what weight we are and all of that and the makeup that we wear and how our hair is done because we want to look good, and we're constantly trying to cover ourselves up with success after success to cover up the acknowledgement that actually we know there's something wrong with us, and Jesus is the only one who can fix that. And as I was praying about it, every night before bed, I read stories to my boys before putting them to bed. And I'd been thinking about this, and Jem had chosen to read a book of poetry. It's like this nonsense poems by Michael Rosen, and they're like genuinely ridiculous. It's not a English teacher trying to get, my son into poetry at a young age. They're just these really silly poems that are full of like silly words and rhythms, and he loves them. And there's one poem in there which is called Let Me Do It. And I love it because it makes me think of Jeremiah. He's 2.5, and he's just at that age where he's like, no, let me do it. And everything he wants to do himself, and it takes like 10 times longer, and he can't actually do it, so he ends up doing it in this haphazard way. And the poem sums him up perfectly. And it goes something like, let me do it, let me do it, let me blow up the balloon, let me do it, let me do it, let me go to the moon. And then it's this little blue creature that's speaking, and he starts doing all these different things, like, let me drive the car, and let me cook the beans, and let me lick the jar, and let me kick the ball, and he does all these different things. And as the poem goes on, because he's so insistent on doing it himself, he ends up doing it all wrong. And by the end of the poem, he's like, let me lick the car, and let me kick the jar, and let me cook the ball. And he's doing everything wrong. And when I was reading that poem to Jeremiah, I suddenly was hit with the fact that that is how God sees me. And when I am running around so busy and tired all the time because I'm constantly having to prove myself and do it myself, God's looking at me and he's like, Mim, you're licking the car. Like, you don't need to be licking the car if you just let me do it for you. If you just let me tell you, you are good enough because I love you. There is nothing you have to do. You are good enough. If you just listened to that truth, you'd be driving the car and I'd be driving it along with you. So I really believe, I'm going to get prayer for that later, but I really believe there will be people here who need to go and pray, stand with somebody else in the church or on our prayer ministry team, pray that Jesus will take away that shame, that Jesus will take away that need to prove yourself, that little voice in your head that's saying you're not good enough, because you are, because Jesus has done it for you.